Everybody, it's fantastic to see you. Welcome to my office where we're going to have a look at 1 Chronicles. So we don't know who wrote 1 Chronicles, but what we do know is that it was written sometime after the exile to Babylon, where the Israels were taken to Babylon and they returned. So it was written sometime after that exile. However, not everybody wanted to return. You see, people had families, they had set up businesses, their entire lives were set up in Babylon, so not everybody had returned. And so Chronicles was written as a way of summarising the Jewish history up until that point. In our Bibles, we've got 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, and then it goes into 1 Chronicles. But in the Jewish Bible, Chronicles comes right at the end as a summary of everything that has happened up until that point. It's a bit of a romantic picture to the Jewish people of the Promised Land, a bit of an advert that says, come back to what God has promised for you. Don't settle, don't compromise in the land of Babylon, but instead come and live in the promises of God. So there are 3 clear parts to the book. The first part lists the key people in the Jewish history. It starts off with Adam and then goes through them. It reads like a long list of names, but each name carries with it an own story of people who either followed God or chose to rebel. With a good reference Bible, you can go through and have fun looking at the stories of many of them. Every so often we get a great paragraph about one of them. It could be one of David's mighty men, or it could be a significant priest, or in 1 Chronicles 4 we get the prayer of Jabez. That was very popular a couple of years ago. I encourage you to go and check that out. That's really good. Then around chapter 10 it moves on to talk about how amazing King David was. And this is really the important part of 1 Chronicles, because 1 Chronicles was really set up to say that David was a great example of a king, and that his desire to build up the temple, to see the Lord God honoured in the temple of Israel was a vision for the future of the people of Israel. So in chapter 10 to 21 it chronicles his great exploits of King David. It does paint him in a very positive light, but the writer knew that you could go back to 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel and read some of the things that David didn't do so well. But instead here it talks about him establishing himself and establishing Israel as a mighty nation to be feared and respected. In 1 Chronicles 16 we get a Psalm of David. That's another nugget to go and check out in 1 Chronicles. Then in chapter 22 to 29 we get David's desire for a great temple to be built for the Lord God. But God tells David he won't be the person to build it, but his son will. So David does everything he can to leave the right legacy for his son. He doesn't build the temple, but he assigns the workforce, the materials. He gives clear instructions and then steps aside. And then in chapter 29, we have David speaking to the people of Israel, declaring his desire for the temple to be built with his son. And that's where I want to focus on just the last part today. In verse 3 it says, "Besides, in my devotion to the temple of my God, I will now give all of my personal treasure of gold and silver for the temple. This is above everything I have provided already for the holy temple." We see that David's love for God shines through in this verse. In verse 5 he then says, "Now who is willing to consecrate themselves to the Lord today?" Who is willing to set themselves apart, to put God as number one in their lives? You know, we should all have that moment and to come back to God every single day and say, Lord, I want to live 100% for you today. I want to be pure. I want to be set apart. And then in verse 6 it says something very significant. It says, "Then the leaders of the tribes of Israel gave willingly." There was a link between the heart desire to live for God and the hands and what they gave. It is a declaration of worship turning into outward giving, not out of need, because it's always good to give to a need, but this wasn't just given to a need. This was given out of love for the Lord. This was an act of worship. They thanked God because they could give. They thanked him because of all the things that he has done for them, for choosing them, for saving them. They wanted God's house to have the best it could possibly have, and so they gave out of their best. So there's a challenge there for you and for me. What are we going to do today as an outward response to that inward desire to put God first? There's no big altar appeal. No one's going to come knocking on your door asking for money. But instead, what are you going to do to respond to God? It could be in money, but it could also be in talent, in strength, in enthusiasm, in any way. Let's make sure that we are giving God our best today. That is the heart of 1 Chronicles. So go and check it out.